Good afternoon, class. This is my oral presentation. I did it on Elizabeth Barrett Browning, or EBB, or Ba, as sometimes she was called by her family and friends. She was popular during the Victorian era, and you'll find it in this book. It was called the Victorian era for Queen Victoria, who reigned between 1837 and 1901. So Elizabeth Barrett Browning was born in 1806. She was the eldest of 11 children. Um, Her family was pretty wealthy. Her dad had owned a couple of plantations in Jamaica. They were sugar plantations. They lived in Herefordshire, and their family home was called Hope End. And like I said, she was wealthy, but they didn't really focus on the education of women back then. So she would sneak into her brother's tutoring sessions and kind of gain as much knowledge as she could. But for most of the part, she was self-taught. She taught herself different languages, including Greek. By the time she was 8 years old, it is said that she could read Homer, and he wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey, so she read it in Greek. She studied Latin. She studied Hebrew. She taught herself all these languages. She read up on history. She read up on literature, and most of this was from her father and her brother's books. At 13, she did publish a volume of poems her dad published. There was about 50 copies made, and they were mostly kept at the house, and some were sent to family members. It was called The Battle of Marathon, and these were heavily religious. The father was very possessive and tyrannical over his children. He told them at a very young age that they were all forbidden to marry, and he didn't want them to actually leave the home. Especially the girls, he wanted them to stay, and so that he could provide for their life. He wanted all this power over them, so he told them they were forbidden to marry. At 14, she had a really bad lung illness, and then at 15, she decided to saddle her horse herself, and it actually slipped off, and she had a spinal injury. So at 14 and 15, she kind of became an invalid. She was prescribed opium and morphine, which she would be on for the rest of her life. Let's see, at 20, she anonymously published an essay on mind and other poems. In 1828, her mother died, and her father was going through a really bad time right now. His business was failing. He was facing lawsuits. And during 1828, when the mother died, they were actually supposed to sell their home, but he ended up going into further debt so the mother could die at the home. Now, during this time, the movement for abolition was growing and growing and growing. Of course, the father's business was slavery. So in 1833, when slavery was abolished, he lost all of his plantations in Jamaica. Although he was still wealthy, they did move around. They did have to sell the home, and they did move around until they finally reached London, and that became the home for the rest of the children and the rest of the father's life. So she continued to post a couple of translations. In 1838, she wrote the Seraphim and Other Poems. The family was still in London, but she relocated to the sea because of her poor health. She went to go live with some of her brothers, and some of her other siblings would come and stay with her, but most of the time it was her favorite brother, Edward. She was really sick, so they said the sea would help her. They did that a lot. Some would go to Lyme, some would go to Bath, just to get the warmer weather, so not such a dreary, cold climate. So she lived there for a couple of years. She became pretty much an invalid and a recluse. She saw mostly only family, although she did continue to write. Let's see. So Edward, after a couple of years, they had an argument, and he walked out at night, and he walked towards the sea, I guess, just to calm down, and he ended up drowning. And Elizabeth, that was such a big heartbreak for her. She never could forgive herself for that, and she always thought of it as her fault. And since it was her favorite brother, she never really got over it, and that attributed to more health problems for her. So she went back to London, and she stayed in her tiny little room. Like I said, she was wealthy, and it was kind of her duty to become the woman of the house, especially with her father getting on in years, but she didn't. She was also given money by a dead aunt. So she just lived on that in her father's house. Her father also contributed, but she didn't really leave her room. She had private maids that would help her, and again, she would just continue to write. In 1844, she published poems. They were popular not only in Britain, but also in America. One of the popular poems to come out of that was The Cry of the Children, which we'll go into more depth later. So she's living with her family, and then Robert Browning, who was also an English poet who had some kind of popularity, not much, but he just fell in love with Elizabeth's writing. He was so attracted to it. He wrote her and said, "Your writing is pretty much amazing. I want to get to know you." And they began to write letters. Over 20 months, they wrote 600 letters back and forth. And these letters were not your typical, "Hey, what's up? How's it going? LOL" letters. They were actually some of the most romantic letters ever written. I do have the world's greatest love letters, and they have 4 of their letters published in this book, so I'll go ahead and read a couple of lines from them. Let's see, this was from Robert to Elizabeth. "I love your verses with all my heart, Miss Barrett, and this is no offhand complimentary letter that I shall write. Whatever else, no prompt matter of course recognition of your genius. And there, a graceful and natural end of the thing. Since the day last week when I first read your poems, I quite laughed to remember how I have been turning and turning again in my mind what I should be able to tell you of the effect on me upon the first flush of delight. I thought I would once get out of my habit of purely passive enjoyment when I do really enjoy and thoroughly justify my admiration." So he's basically just writing, ever since I've been reading your work, I can't stop thinking about you and the words that you write. And he says, I've been turning, he can't sleep, he's constantly thinking about it, almost obsessive. And she writes, "I will say that I am your debtor, not only for this cordial letter, for all the pleasure which came with it, but in other ways, and those the highest, I will say that while I live to follow this divine art of poetry, in proportion to my love for it and my devotion to it, I must be a devout admirer and student of your works. This is in my heart to say to you, and I say it. And for the rest, I am proud to remain your obliged and faithful EBB." So this book has 4 of their love letters to each other. Like I said, they have over 600. Some people have published full books of all their letters, or all their letters that they could find. And so begins one of the greatest love stories for writers, especially during this time. There was 2 movies made of Robert Browning and Elizabeth. There was also a play, and like I said, many books were also written. So she would have several guests come up to her tiny little room, but it was mostly family, and the family was quite shocked when she did allow Robert Browning to come up into her room, and they would discuss things, and of course there would be a chaperone in there, but they would just discuss her works, his writings, the social climate of that day, just going back and forth. So since the father disapproved of any of them getting married, she did discuss, we're falling in love, I want to marry him. So the father disapproved. He was really angry about this. So what they did is they went ahead and got married in 1846. They eloped. They went right down to the street to a church. And the couple left to Italy. They traveled around for a little while, and then they finally settled in Florence at their house called Casa Guidi. The father never talked or saw his daughter ever again. He became very angry over this. Okay. So also during the time that Elizabeth Browning and Robert were writing letters, she also secretly wrote sonnets. She called them the sonnets from Portuguese because she didn't want people to think that they were from her or they were her personal experience. So she kind of made it seem like they were just a translation of sonnets from the Portuguese. And there were 44 love sonnets, and they were all dedicated to Robert. So like I said, they were written during the courtship. Nobody knew about these sonnets, not even Robert knew. She didn't put them in any of her letters. In 1850, she told him, hey, I have these sonnets that I wrote you. What do you think? And she let him read it, and he was just astounded by her work. He was like, these are the most beautiful things I've ever read in my life. You need to get these published. So she ended up doing that. During this time, her health increased. She was just doing so much better, to the fact that in 1849 she had a son. They called him Penn. And I mean, a woman who was so sickly and who just stayed in her room was now all of a sudden traveling and having a son. And at this time, let's see, she was born in 1806. So when she had her son in 1849, she was in her 40s. And during this time, women barely survived childbirth, much less in your 40s. So she was doing fantastic at this time. She and her husband, Robert, became really political at this time, since they did live in Italy. Italy at this time was under the rule of Austria, and they became Italian nationalists, and they were always fighting for Italian independence. She wrote a couple of things called Casa Guidi windows. It's basically what she saw through her house. Like, she saw people marching and people wanting their freedom from Austria, and the revolutions that were going on during this time. So she wrote about that. She also wrote A Curse for a Nation, and that was pretty much directed towards America and the abolition of slavery. And then she also wrote Aurora Leigh, which is her longest poem, and that's kind of more of womenly rights and social reform. So so she lived a pretty happy life after this. She died in her husband's arms, which is also pretty romantic. And let's see. So some of her great works, like I did mention, The Cry of the Children that she wrote, it was based on the morality of child labor and how it went against everything, or the immorality of child labor. During this time, England was going through the Industrial Revolution, and you have great works that not only Emily Browning wrote, but you can also look at the horrible labor that children had to endure with the book North and South. It just talks about how children would work to the bone day and night. They would fill their lungs with, if they had to work in like the cotton industry to make clothes, the factories, it would be like puff would get into their lungs and they couldn't breathe and they would have an early death. They would work in the coal mines, of course, again, suffocation. So it's a poem about dark and despair, and it talks about how children should be playing and how you don't hear children's laughter, how you hear them crying. And there's a little girl in the poem named Alice, and Alice passes away from working too hard. And the children aren't sad for her. They actually celebrate her death. They're saying, now you can go and be a child. Now you're in heaven. You can rest now. You can get some sleep. You can eat. And it's just this beautiful poem that she got a lot of recognition for. Another one was The Runaway Slave at Pilgrim's Point. Now, Pilgrim's Point talks about like when the Pilgrims first landed in America. This poem was actually posted in a Boston newspaper, so that her popularity again grew in America. So it talks about a female who's a runaway slave, and it talks about how she met someone who was also a slave, and she loved them, but now she's running away. And she talked about how she has a baby, and she doesn't feel a connection with this child. And she talks about how her skin is dark, but the baby's is light, which then you realize, okay, there was some sexual abuse going on between the master and the slave, and she ended up having a baby from it. The woman actually ends up killing this baby because she's looking down at him, and there's no connection between her and this child. And she says, we won't be accepted because I'm black, you're white, and I don't want to remember anything from this plantation, and every time I look at you, I see my master's face. She's like, this baby's making the same face as my master's did. So she ends up suffocating the child. And when people first read this poem, they were shocked. Like, people thought, okay, this either has to be banned, or we have to actually start looking into the horrific things that women go through on a plantation. So, like I said, she was separated from love. She had to deal with rape. She can't look at her child's face. And she has this conversation because she ends up going to this place where the Pilgrims first landed, and they were trying to escape persecution. And she's trying to do the same, and she's trying to talk to God. She's like, I'm sorry for what I've done, but at the same time, what do you expect from me? This is the life we live in. When you said that men can be free, were you talking about slaves too? When you made us, God, you said you made us in we were your creation. What about us? Why is slavery? Why do people still have slavery? So this poem goes into that. Her last poem, or her longest poem, was Aurora Leigh. And some people say that it might reflect her life. When you read it, you're like, wow, okay, this woman does have similarities to Elizabeth Barrett Browning. So it was a woman poet who was actually born in Italy. And she actually goes to England, and she talks about how submissive women are taught to be. And there's only certain things that they can do. Kind of reverts back to her childhood, as she wasn't supposed to be learning like her brothers were, and how she had to kind of sneak in with her brother's tutors to get some teaching other than by herself. So Aurora Leigh, she sneaks up to this attic, and she finds her old father's books, and she secretly teaches herself, and she secretly reads. Again, it kind of mirrors Elizabeth Browning's life. She talks about society, and then there is some love, but at first she meets this man, and they don't have anything in common really, and she realizes this man doesn't want to marry me for me. He wants me to help him in his endeavors, but he doesn't want to marry me for love. And then there's another character, Marion. She does love him, and then the guy, they're supposed to get married, but there's another character that comes into it. It's a very soap opera like poem. So this woman's kind of like, hey, you're not good enough for the man that you're supposed to marry, so we're gonna say he doesn't love you, and you know what, you need to just move on. So she does. This woman takes her to a brothel, and she tries to run away, but she's raped, and she also becomes pregnant. And then again, this was also shocking to find out. So Aurora Leigh is trying to write, and she comes in contact with Mary, and again she sees that she does have a child, and she feels so sorry for her. So she's like, come and live with me, and I'll help you any way that I can. And in the end, Aurora Lee does go back to the man that she said that she didn't want to marry, because there was no love. They ended up falling in love with each other. So it was kind of a back and forth with this poem, but it had a lot of um, of what society was like for females put in. You know, how if women didn't grow up in a wealthy lifestyle, they had the workhouse, they had brothels to turn to, they were raped, you know, they were basically property. And she did write about that, which I guess the people also found shocking. So I did want to read a couple of the poems. Okay, so this is from The Runaway Slave at Pilgrim's Point. I stand on the mark beside the shore of the first white pilgrim's bended knee, where exile turned to ancestor and God was thanked for liberty. Okay. We're skipping a couple of lines here. Why, in that single glance I had of my child's face, I tell you all, I saw a look that made me mad, that master's look, that used to fall on my soul like a lash, or worse. And so, to save me from my curse, I twisted it in my shawl. So again, she talks about how she's at this place of freedom, and then she goes and she's angry at her child, and all he does is remind her of being beaten and raped on this plantation. So that was from The Runaway Slave at Pilgrim's Point. Okay, so I also had another book, A Treasury of Poems, which of course she's in, and I did want to read a couple of the sonnets. And people are going to recognize this. This is called When Our Two Souls stand up erect and strong, face to face, silent, drawing nigh and nigher, until the lengthening wings break into fire. At either curved point, what bitter wrong can the earth do to us, that we should not long, but here contented? So that one is one of her famous ones, and then this one by far is her famous work. Again, these are her sonnets from the Portuguese. So these are now just called Love Sonnets of Elizabeth Browning. How do I love thee? How do I love thee? Let me count the ways. I love thee to depth and breadth and height my soul can reach, when feeling out of sight, or ends of being an ideal grace. I love thee to the level of every day's most quiet need by sun and candlelight. I love thee freely, as men strive for right. I love thee purely, as they turn from praise. So, yeah, this is just a little bit of her writing, but again, How Do I Love Thee is one of her most popular ones. Yeah, so she's pretty much known for that poem. She's really into the romantic era, I guess. Now people said, oh, we know her from her romantic poems, but given her past life and all of her other writings about the social culture going on, and it's kind of nice to know that she did have a second chance in her life. She was an invalid from her father and basically taking morphine and opium every day, and then notice how her life bloomed in the second part of it in her 40s, and she was able to find love, to marry. And a side note, she was 6 years older than Robert, and she was kind of like, why is he falling in love with me? I'm under my father's thumb, and I live in this room and I don't see anyone, and I just write. And it's kind of nice to know that she was able to find love, someone who loved her and for her writing. And yeah, it was really good to see that she got her happy ending, and it was just beyond romantic that she got to die in her lover's arms. So just thank you, and if you guys have any questions, go ahead and shoot them over, and I hope this brings you more into Elizabeth Barrett Browning. Thank you. Have a good day.